I used to think my grandmother Eleanor West was invincible. She had that kind of presence, rooted, unshakable, like an old oak tree in the middle of a storm. No matter what happened in our family, no matter who was fighting with whom, she was the one who set things right. She was the one who held it all together. But lately, she'd been slipping. It started with the little things. Names swapped, dates forgotten, stories trailing off mid-sentence. At first we brushed it off. She was 72. People forget things. But then the forgetting became something else, something bigger, something that settled into her bones. Still, we held on to tradition. Sunday dinner at Gran's house. The house smelled like roasted chicken and rosemary when I walked in, the same as always, the same as it had smelled my entire life. The dining room table was set, the mismatched plates stacked neatly, silverware laid out, everything in its place. Except Gran herself, who stood in the kitchen, staring at the open refrigerator, her brow furrowed. "Gran?" I said, stepping beside her. She blinked and looked at me, smiling the way she always did when she saw me. "Rachel, sweetheart, what are we looking for?" Her face went blank. Then a little laugh, but forced. "Oh, just the salt. I could have sworn I put it on the table." It was sitting right there next to the butter dish. I grabbed it and set it in front of her, but she barely seemed to notice. Margaret, my mother, swept into the kitchen. "Dinner's ready. Daniel's already complaining that he's starving." My uncle, always impatient. Some things never changed. We gathered around the table. The same table my grandfather had built before he passed, its wood worn smooth by years of elbows resting, hands gripping, fingers tracing the carved edges. Conversations overlapped, voices rising and falling in a rhythm we'd known forever. Gran was quiet, though. She ate slowly, her fork hovering between bites. Then, out of nowhere, she said it. "Lillian?" The name came out like a breath, like something delicate and breakable. Her hand paused in the air, her eyes unfocused. I set my glass down. "Who's Lillian?" Gran turned to me, a flicker of something, sadness, uncertainty, crossing her face. "Lillian?" she repeated as if hearing it for the first time. She gave a small shake of her head. "I don't know a Lillian. But you just said, 'It's nothing.'" My mother's voice cut in, brisk and dismissive. She barely looked up from slicing into her chicken. "She's been mixing things up lately," Daniel nodded. "Last week she called me James." James had been my grandfather's name. Gran laughed lightly, but I saw the way her fingers tightened around her fork. "Well, I suppose that's just the way of things," she said. But the way she looked down, the way she suddenly wouldn't meet my eyes, it didn't sit right. It was just a name that meant nothing. And yet, for the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lillian did mean something. That whoever she was, Gran had not just remembered her, she had felt her. And maybe, just maybe, she was someone we were never meant to know about. I stayed at Gran's house for the next few days, partly because she seemed more forgetful than usual, and partly because I couldn't stop thinking about that name, Lillian. It felt like an intruder, something that had forced its way into our carefully constructed family history. Gran had always told the same stories, over and over. Her childhood summers on the lake, the day she met my grandfather, the way my mother had been a stubborn child, impossible to keep still. I knew those stories by heart, but she had never, not once, mentioned a Lillian. And yet, the name kept surfacing. On Tuesday afternoon, she dozed off in her chair while I read beside her, and just as she slipped into sleep, I heard her whisper, "Lillian." The next morning, while she stirred her coffee, she muttered, "I wonder if Lillian is cold." And then there were the times she didn't say it, but I saw it in her face. That distant, longing look, like she was somewhere else entirely. I brought it up to my mother that evening while she stood at the sink rinsing dishes. "Mom, who's Lillian?" She didn't even turn around. "No one." "But Gran keeps saying the name. She's confused, Rachel." I folded my arms. "Confused about what? It's not a random word, it's a name. And it's not just a one-time thing, she keeps." My mother sighed, turning off the water. When she finally looked at me, her expression was tight, like she had been expecting this conversation and dreading it. "She doesn't know a Lillian. But what if she's forgetting, not remembering?" My mother dried her hands and threw the towel over the sink. "Her mind is mixing things up, pulling names from books she's read, movies she's seen, people from her past that didn't matter." But what if this person did matter? My mother's jaw clenched. just slightly. I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't been watching her so closely. "It's not important," she said before walking out of the kitchen. It was the way she said it. Too quick, too certain, like she was trying to shut a door that should have never been opened. Later that night, I lay awake in the guest room. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards settling, the hum of the refrigerator. I told myself to drop it, to let it go, like my mother and uncle clearly wanted me to. But something about it stuck to me, clung like damp fabric, and then a sound, soft, almost swallowed by the dark. I sat up, straining to listen. A voice, Gran's voice. Muffled, broken by sleep, I crept out of bed and stood in the doorway of her room. She was murmuring, tangled in the sheets, her breathing uneven. Then, clear as day, she said it. "I'm sorry, my love." A pause. "I should have found you. I should have found you." A chill moved through me. I watched her for a long time, waiting for something else, for another glimpse into the past. She had started speaking aloud in her sleep. But she only stirred, her brow knitting like she was chasing something she couldn't catch. And I stood there in the dark, knowing, without fully understanding why, that I needed to find out who Lillian was, even if no one else wanted me to. Gran was slipping further. It wasn't just the small forgettings anymore, the misplaced salt, the unfinished sentences. It was the bigger things, the kind that made my stomach twist. On Thursday morning, I walked into the kitchen and found her standing by the stove, staring at a cold, empty pan. "Gran?" She looked at me, vacant for a second too long, then smiled. "Oh, sweetheart, She hesitated. Her mouth opened, then closed. I saw her struggle. She didn't know my name. I felt it in the space between us, the way her fingers curled against the counter, searching for something to hold on to. Then relief in her eyes, like she had grabbed onto the right thread at the last second. "Rachel," she said, and let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. "Of course, Rachel." I forced a smile. "Yeah, it's just me." She smiled back, but the moment had already bruised something inside me. Later that afternoon, I helped her sort through the guest room closet, a project she had insisted on, claiming she wanted things to be in order. Halfway through, I found it. A small wooden box, tucked into the very back of the closet, behind a stack of old towels and a shoebox filled with old Christmas cards. I don't know why, but the moment I touched it, something deep in my gut tightened. It had been wrapped in an old cloth, deliberately hidden. The wood was aged, the clasp rusted. I opened it. Inside, folded letters, fragile with time. A tiny silver baby bracelet, the kind they put on newborns in hospitals. The initials LW engraved on the band. And underneath it all, a photograph. A young Eleanor, barely older than a teenager, cradling a newborn baby in her arms. The breath left my lungs. I turned to Gran, my hands shaking. "Who is this?" Her entire body stilled. For a moment, she just looked at the picture. Then, before I could even see it coming, she snatched it from my hands. "No," she said sharply, her whole body trembling. "Gran!" "She was mine," her voice broke, and she clutched the photograph against her chest. "They took her. I couldn't stop them." Tears welled in her eyes, but she wasn't looking at me anymore. She was somewhere else. Somewhere years and years ago. And I stood there watching my grandmother grieve a name she had nearly forgotten, realizing Lillian wasn't just a name. Lillian was her daughter. I didn't wait. The moment Gran fell asleep, I took the photograph and the baby bracelet and drove to my mother's house. She opened the door, already irritated. "Rachel, it's late." "I found this," I said, holding out the box's contents before she could shut me out. "Who is Lillian?" Her face shifted, too quickly, too controlled. She barely glanced at the photo before shaking her head. "Where did you get this?" "It was hidden in Gran's closet. She said Lillian was hers." My voice tightened. "She said they took her." A flash of something, pain, anger, crossed my mother's face. But then she schooled it back into indifference. "You shouldn't be digging through her things." "Mom, this is exactly why I didn't want you staying with her too long," she snapped. "She gets confused, Rachel. She's not thinking straight." "She was thinking straight when she said it," I shot back, "and you know it." Her silence was answer enough. I turned to my Uncle Daniel, who had been sitting stiffly in the living room, watching the exchange like a man trying to decide if he was part of this war or a bystander. "Did you know?" I asked him. He let out a slow breath. "No," he admitted. "But he rubbed a hand over his jaw. I always felt like there was something missing. She never talked much about her life before Grandpa. My mother turned on him. "You're really going to entertain this?" "She had a daughter," I said. "A daughter we never knew about." My mother's expression hardened. "And what do you want to do about it, Rachel? Go on some wild goose chase, drag up pain for no reason? This was her choice, her past. You have no right to go poking around in it." "She didn't choose," I said, my voice shaking. "They took her." My mother turned away, arms crossed, jaw clenched. Daniel exhaled. "Maybe we should at least ask Gran. She won't even remember by tomorrow." I wasn't so sure. That night, I sat beside Gran as she dozed in her chair, waiting for her to come back. And then she did. Her eyes cleared just for a moment the way the sky does after a storm. I didn't waste time. "Lillian," I said softly. Her breath caught. I held up the photograph. "She was yours, wasn't she?" A tear slipped down her cheek. She nodded. "Tell me," I whispered. Her voice trembled, but she didn't hesitate. "I was 18. My parents," she swallowed. "They wouldn't let me keep her. I wasn't married. They said it would ruin me." I clenched my fists. "They sent me away," she continued, her voice cracking, "to a home for girls like me. She looked at the photograph. "I held her. Once. Just once." "Gran," her hands shook. "They took her the next morning. They didn't even let me say goodbye." I felt something inside me break apart. "Did you ever try to find her?" Her gaze flickered. Fear, sorrow, guilt. "No," she whispered. "I wanted to, but I was afraid. Afraid of what I would find. Afraid she'd hate me." Tears slid down my face. "She wouldn't." Gran shook her head. "I should have found her." Her voice rose, desperate now. "I need to. I need to find her before I—" Her fingers pressed against her temple, her expression suddenly panicked. Like she could feel the forgetting creeping in. I grabbed her hands. "We'll find her," I promised. "I won't let you forget her." Her body sagged, relief mixing with sorrow. I didn't know how yet. But I knew this. I was going to find Lillian, even if I had to do it alone. I couldn't let it go. The name Lillian West was etched into my brain like an unfinished story, one that had been buried for decades, waiting for someone to turn the page. So I started searching. At first, it felt impossible. Where do you begin looking for someone who has been missing from your family for over 50 years? There was no paper trail, no mention of her in any of Gran's documents. It was like she had been erased before she even had a chance to exist. But I didn't stop. For days, I sat at my laptop, sifting through old newspaper archives, public records, and adoption registries. Some files were too old to be digital, locked away in physical archives. I called adoption agencies, trying to find records from the 1950s, hitting dead ends at every turn. And then I found her. It was in an old birth registry from 1951. The details matched. A baby girl born in Pennsylvania, in a maternity home for unwed mothers, Lillian West. But that wasn't the name she had lived with. Her adoptive name was Lillian Cooper. I stared at the screen for a long time, my heart hammering. She was real. She wasn't just a whisper in Gran's dreams. She existed. She had a life. The relief was short-lived. That same night, Gran disappeared. It was almost midnight when the phone rang. I had fallen asleep at my desk, the laptop screen still glowing. My mother's voice jolted me awake. "Mom's missing." I was out the door before she finished the sentence. When I got to Gran's house, my mother was already standing outside, arms wrapped tightly around herself. The neighbor who found her, a retired teacher named Mrs. Holloway, stood nearby looking shaken. "She was walking down the street in her nightgown," Mrs. Holloway explained. "No shoes, nothing. I asked her where she was going, and she hesitated. She said she was looking for Lillian." My mother's eyes snapped to mine, filled with unspoken anger. I didn't say anything. I just pushed past her and into the house. Gran was sitting in her armchair, wrapped in a thick blanket. Her hands trembled as she held a mug of tea. She looked up at me, and for the first time in weeks I saw fear in her eyes. "I couldn't find her," she whispered. I knelt beside her. "You don't have to, Gran," I said softly. "I found her," she gasped. For a moment, just a flicker, her old self returned. Her back straightened. Her hands stilled. "She's alive," she whispered. I nodded. Tears welled in her eyes. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the moment was gone. Her face fell, her expression crumbling. "I won't remember this tomorrow, will I?" The question shattered me. I reached for her hand, squeezing it. "I'll remember for you." The next morning, my mother and uncle sat me down. "We need to talk about assisted living," my mother said. Gran overheard. She lashed out, furious, wild, a force of nature fighting against a tide she couldn't control. "You want to lock me up?" she shouted. "You want me to be one of those women sitting in a room full of strangers, staring at the walls until I disappear completely?" "Mom, it's not like that," my mother said. "You wandered into the street last night. What if Mrs. Holloway hadn't seen you? What if something had happened?" Gran's hands clenched into fists. "You won't do this to me." She looked at me then, desperate, pleading. "Rachel," she whispered, "please don't let them take me away." And just like that, I understood. She wasn't just afraid of a nursing home. She was afraid of being forgotten. And I wasn't going to let that happen. I found her. It had taken hours of searching, combing through records, cross-referencing old addresses, and a few desperate emails to people who probably thought I was crazy. But I did it. Lillian Cooper was real, and she was only 2 towns away. I stared at the address on my screen, my pulse hammering. 50 miles. That was all that separated Gran from the daughter she had lost. The daughter she had never stopped whispering for in her sleep. I should have felt relief, but what I felt instead was fear. Because now I had to tell my family. We gathered in my mother's living room, me, her, and Uncle Daniel. The tension was thick, like something that had been building for years and had finally cracked open. "She's alive," I said. "She's here." Silence. Daniel exhaled first, rubbing his hands together like he was trying to warm himself. Jesus. Margaret didn't react. She just stared at me, her expression unreadable. "We have to tell Gran," I pushed. "No," my mother said immediately. My jaw tightened. "What do you mean, no?" "She's sick, Rachel." Margaret's voice was sharp, controlled. "She's barely holding on as it is." "She's holding on because of this." I leaned forward. "Don't you see? She's losing everything, Mom, but she still remembers her. That means something." My mother's hands curled into fists in her lap. Something was shifting in her, something breaking apart. "She gave her up," she said, her voice low. "That was her choice. That was her past, and now, after all these years, you think you can just—" "What? Fix it?" Daniel sighed. "Margaret?" "No," she snapped. She turned back to me, her eyes flashing. "You have no idea what it was like growing up with her. Always hiding something, always avoiding questions about her past. You think this is just about Lillian?" She let out a harsh laugh. "This is about everything she buried, and now you want to dig it up and throw it in her face?" I swallowed hard. "I don't want to hurt her," I said quietly. "I want to give her peace." My mother shook her head. "She's not going to find peace in this." A long silence stretched between us. Then Daniel cleared his throat. "I always knew there was something," he murmured. "Something she wouldn't talk about." Margaret turned to him, her expression suddenly raw. "Then why didn't you ask?" His voice was gentle. "Because she didn't want me to." For the first time, my mother's face cracked. I saw it then, the pain beneath her anger. She had spent her whole life watching Gran carry this weight, pretending it didn't exist. And now I was dragging it into the light. "You don't have to come," I said finally. "But I'm going." Margaret wiped a hand over her face. She didn't try to stop me, and that was how I knew. Somewhere, deep down, she wanted me to. That night, I sat in my car outside Lillian Cooper's house. It was a small, single-story home, with a porch light glowing softly in the dusk. It looked ordinary, unremarkable. It had taken 72 years to get here. I took a breath, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Then I stepped out of the car, and I knocked on the door. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. It was the only sound as I stood on Lillian Cooper's front porch, staring at the wooden door, my knuckles hovering inches from the surface. It wasn't too late to walk away. Maybe my mother was right. Maybe this wasn't my story to tell. But then I thought of Gran's voice in the dark, whispering, "I should have found you." I knocked. A pause. Footsteps. The door opened. Lillian Cooper was not what I expected. She was in her early 50s, her hair light brown, streaked with gray. She had gentle eyes, ones that had seen both kindness and loss. She wasn't beautiful in a striking way, but she had the kind of presence that made you want to lean in closer. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but cautious. I opened my mouth, but for a second, nothing came out. "How do you tell someone they've been missing from their own story?" "My name is Rachel," I managed. I think we need to talk." She invited me inside, Her house was warm, comfortable, filled with books and soft colors. I sat on the edge of her couch, hands folded tightly together. She poured tea, then sat across from me. "So," she said, her voice careful, measured. "Why are you here?" I took a deep breath. I don't know how to say this without it sounding huge. A soft laugh. "It sounds pretty huge already." I smiled, then set the photograph on the coffee table between us, the one of Gran holding her newborn. Lillian looked at it and froze. Her fingers hovered above the image but didn't touch it. Her breathing had changed, slightly sharper. Then she whispered, "That's me." I swallowed hard. "Yes." She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply before opening them again. "She's my mother?" I nodded. She exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over her mouth. "I always wondered." She gave a small, dry laugh. "I never searched, though. I figured if she had wanted to find me, she would have." "She did," I said, my voice thick. "She just thought she couldn't." Lillian looked down. "She never forgot me?" I shook my head. "Not even now, even as she's forgetting so much else." Her eyes shone with something deep, fragile. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything." She picked up the photo, studied it for a long time. Then she looked up. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted. "What if it's too late?" Her words hit like a sharp wind. "It's not too late," I said. "She still has time, and so do you." Lillian swallowed, looked away. I saw the fear there, the uncertainty. "I need to think," she said softly. "This is a lot." I nodded. "I understand." And I did, but I also knew time was running out. I drove home with a sinking feeling in my chest. Lillian hadn't promised anything. She had listened, nodding, pressing the photograph between her fingers like it was something sacred. But when it came time to decide, she hesitated, and hesitation felt like a door quietly closing. Gran was getting worse. Her lucid moments came less often, her words slurring together, sentences left unfinished. Sometimes she got lost in her own house, standing in the hallway like she had forgotten which way led back to the person she used to be. One night, I found her sitting in her armchair, hands folded in her lap. She was crying silently. I crouched beside her. "Gran?" She looked at me, her blue eyes watery and searching. Then she reached out, brushing my cheek with trembling fingers. "My sweet girl," she whispered. "You came back to me." Something cold and sharp settled in my chest. She wasn't looking at me. She was seeing Lillian. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. "Gran, it's me. It's Rachel." But she only shook her head, smiling through her tears. "I waited so long," she whispered. "I thought I'd never get to see you again." Her fingers clutched mine, desperate, pleading, and I did the only thing I could. I let her believe it. I let her hold my hand like I was the daughter she had lost. I let her have that moment, because I knew it wouldn't be long now. The next morning, I drove back to Lillian's house. I left a letter in her mailbox. The words were simple, raw. "She doesn't have much time. If you want to meet her, it has to be now." I didn't wait for a response, because I wasn't sure I'd get one. Chapter 9, A Mother's Final Memory. We gathered in the house for what we feared might be her last lucid day. Gran was slipping, drifting in and out of awareness like a boat losing its anchor. She spent most of the morning staring at nothing, lost somewhere inside herself. My mother sat beside her, silent. Daniel paced. No one spoke about Lillian, because we had stopped hoping, until the knock came. I froze. Daniel and my mother exchanged stunned glances. I was the first to move, my heart pounding as I opened the door. Lillian stood there. She looked nervous, a bouquet of flowers in her hand. "I don't know if she'll even know who I am," she said softly. I swallowed hard. "There's only one way to find out." The room was silent when we walked in. Gran sat in her chair, frail and small, a shadow of the woman she once was. She was staring at the window, lost in thought. Lillian hesitated. I saw the fear in her, the what if she doesn't know me, what if I came too late? Then Gran blinked. Her gaze sharpened for the first time in days, and when she looked at Lillian, the world seemed to stop. Her lips parted, trembling. "Lillian?" The name was clear, steady, like it had never left her. Lillian let out a breath, a broken, disbelieving sound before stepping forward. Gran lifted a shaking hand, reaching out. "You came back," she whispered. Tears filled her eyes. Lillian fell to her knees beside her, clutching her hand. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm here." A single tear rolled down Gran's cheek. "I never stopped loving you," she murmured. "I never forgot." For a moment, she wasn't fading. She wasn't forgetting. She wasn't slipping away. For a moment, she was the strong, unbreakable woman she had always been, holding the daughter she had lost. A week later, Gran was gone. She passed in her sleep, just as the sun rose, with Lillian sitting beside her, holding her hand until the very end. There was no struggle, no pain, just a quiet fading, like the last ember of a fire finally giving in to the dark. And somehow, even in the weight of our grief, there was a kind of peace in it. She had found Lillian before the forgetting could take her completely. She had spoken her name. She had held her hand. She had remembered. The funeral was small. Lillian stood beside us, not as an outsider, but as one of us. I watched the way my mother softened toward her, the way Daniel made space for her in conversations, as if she had always been there. And maybe in some way, she had. She had just been waiting to be found. After everyone left, I stayed behind. The cemetery was quiet, the air heavy with winter's first chill. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out Gran's baby bracelet, the tiny silver band, still engraved with LW. It had been the first thing that told me Lillian was real, and now it would be the last thing I left with Gran. I placed it gently beside the flowers, my fingers lingering for just a moment. "She never forgot you," I whispered. The wind stirred, soft, almost like an answer. I closed my eyes, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Gran was gone, but her love, her memory, her name, that would never fade.